In 1911, Ricciotto Canuto wrote an article titled The Birth of the Sixth Art, in which he established that film, made possible by the cinematograph or camera, was emerging as a new, discrete form of art, the sixth to be exact, following music, poetry, agriculture, sculpture, and painting. He later went back and added dance, pushing cinema back to seventh place. Germaine Dulac expressed a nearly identical sentiment in 1925 with an article titled The Essence of the Cinema, the Visual Idea, in which she called the cinema the seventh art, following painting, music, poetry, sculpture, dance, and architecture. Canuto and Dulac were writing at a time when the cinema was still in its infancy, though the exact birthday of cinema is contested, as with the birth of all arts, which emerged not spontaneously in whole, but as a result of many years of cultural and technological development, but we'll get to that. In 1911 and 1925, the cinema was only about 16 and 30 years old, respectively, if we are to use the Lumiere brothers' first screening as its birth date. We see the novelty and strangeness of this art form reflected in the writings of Canuto and Dulac, who, despite clearly lauding the art form for its freshness and uniqueness, still viewed it as unpolished. Canuto wrote that the cinema, quote, imposes itself on the unquiet and scrutinous spirit. It will be a superb conciliation of rhythms in space, the plastic arts, and the rhythms of time, music, and poetry. Here and throughout, Canuto makes clear that film at its current stage is, or at least was, incomplete. However, this quote also reveals that Canuto viewed the sixth-seventh art not only as an emerging art form, but as the one that might possibly bring together all existing art forms. In other words, film, to Canuto, was something of a perfect art, or would be. Dulac similarly welcomed the cinema, writing that, for many centuries, there were only six arts: painting, music, poetry, sculpture, dance, architecture, and anyone who claimed to add a new element to this magnificent cohort would have been considered completely crazy. Another art form? What an absurdity! Was such a thing necessary? Did artists really need a new form to express themselves? Human sensibility could already flow out abundantly through existing channels. That a new art form should spring up among the others appeared both useless and foolish. Nevertheless, a new caste of artists was born. One not content to seek expression of its sensibility and intelligence in any of the existing art forms. They are neither literary artists, nor playwrights, nor painters, nor sculptors, nor architects, nor musicians. They are filmmakers, for whom the art of motion, as embodied by the cinema, is a unique form of expression. Despite this excitement, Dulac gestured heavily toward the nascent status of the form, stating that, at this time, I repeat, filmmakers, those who feel the need to express themselves with motion, do not yet exist in the intellectual world. These writings by Canuto and Dulac are two of many similar writings that have come out throughout the years. Hugo Munsterberg, in his 1916 article, Why We Go to the Movies, had a subsection titled A New Form of Art, in which he likewise identified the novelty of film and, in other subsections, such as the close-up, pointed out the precise elements and capabilities of the cinematic form that made it stand out from the rest. Sergei Eisenstein devoted much of his writing and lifetime to similar articles, such as in essays The Dramaturgy of Film Form, The Dialectical Approach to Film Form, written in 1928, and Montage in Architecture, written sometime between 1937 and 1940. Why does this matter to us, especially now? These articles establish that, beginning at least in the early 20th century, the cinema was becoming something of an accepted and respected cultural phenomenon. We see this reflected not only in the writing, but also who was doing the writing. At the time of his article's release, Ricciotto Canuto was a respected art critic who eventually turned into one of the earliest film theoreticians, seen by many as the inaugural aesthetician of cinema, and devoted much of the rest of his life to the study and subsequent legitimization of the form, inspiring many of the cinema's earliest and best recognized filmmakers and experimenters, such as John Epstein and Abel Gance, along the way. Germaine Dulac was a filmmaker, film theorist, critic, and journalist. Hugo Munsterberg was a psychologist known for his influential work in applied psychology, industrial organizational psychology, and more. Sergei Eisenstein was a filmmaker, theorist, and teacher, and is widely regarded as one of the most important filmmakers of all time. What these names and titles mean, in association to the words espoused by their holders, is that film was something to be taken seriously. In fact, it already at this time was being taken seriously. Thinking about film, about its place in the world, and among other arts, was a worthwhile endeavor, and the people that took part in that endeavor were regarded with significant importance. The cinema's importance is and was affirmed at various levels. For one, the financial sector through capital gain, films grossing millions or even billions of dollars in the box office. In the cultural sector through prestigious award shows, film festivals, and museum screenings. In the social sector with the rise of cinephilia and the celebrity status enjoyed by film stars and makers. However, at one level, it still seems to be on shaky grounds, that being the institutional level, and it's possible that, despite their best effort, the problem began with Canuto, Dulac, Munsterberg, and Eisenstein. In this video essay, I hope to break down film's contentious relationship to the other arts, especially literature, and interrogate the cinema's place as a subject of history and culture as well as an object. In his 1980 essay, What Novels Can Do That Films Can't, and Vice Versa, narratologist Seymour Chatman assigned hierarchical difference between media forms, with narrative structure and functionality as his reference point. In questioning which form, novels or film, best function towards the end of telling a story, Chatman concluded that it was novels which were superior, given that the author was in control of his words in a way that a director or filmmaker could never be with his camera. Cameras, he argued, unlike pens or pencils, captured everything that came before them indiscriminately. Films, as a result, were products of chance and coincidence, with editing and post-production allowing for some cleaning up, but never achieving the desired result. Authorial intent was given a privileged position, clearly. As follows, adapting written word in film always came with a loss of integrity. What results from Chatman's idea is the belief that art forms are necessarily segregated from each other and cast against each other. Unfairly so, given that, at least to Chatman, some forms were simply better than others and were thus destined to win. Chatman's claims are, of course, highly provocative and contested, but they shouldn't be entirely dismissed. Chatman, an established narratologist, having devoted many years and books to these ideas, such as texts like Story and Discourse, Narrative Structure in Fiction and Film, published in 1980, and Coming to Terms, The Rhetoric of Narrative in Fiction and Film, published in 1990, makes assertions reminiscent to those made by Canuto and Dulac, except here he makes the boundaries between the forms more explicit and impermeable. Despite how anyone feels about what Chatman is saying, his ideas reflect a core reality of film and film studies, one that may not have been chosen but was nevertheless given and kept, which is the need to affirm difference from other art forms. How can one critique Chatman's ideas when it seems like he is writing within a tradition of film theorizing established all the way back in 1911? Canuto and Dulac's laudatory statements on films are given expressly because they saw that film succeeded at establishing its uniqueness, discreteness, inherent difference from what came before it in ways which other art forms tried and failed. Completeness achieved by total difference, independence. In a word, individuation. However, at the institutional level, at least in America, this status was not given to film from the onset. As film studies began to enter the institution by way of university classes, it was not housed under its own department, but rather awkwardly juggled around and between existing departments, such as mass communications, psychology, sociology, theater, art, and English, where it finally seemed, for the most part, to find its home. Film and film studies historian Eric Smouden identifies Robert Gessner's 1938 class, History and Appreciation of the Cinema, as one of the earliest of the subject, taught at NYU, notable for its highly regarded and established cinema studies program, founded 27 years after Gessner's class in 1965. Of the class, Smouden writes, the title of the class and topic headings give a strong indication of Gessner's approach, which clearly appears to be centered on the history of texts, on the films themselves, and on ways of making meaning from them by clustering them around national and generic concerns, differentiating one film from another, and ranking them. Also, Robert Gessner's approach, which owes much to art history and literary history, has become the dominant mode of the practice of film scholarship in the United States. What Smouden, here writing in 2007, seemed to identify is the double bind that film studies found itself in and continues to some degree to be in this present moment. Given its institutional history with relation to English and literary studies, film studies has two inheritances. One, literary analysis as the main mode of analysis, with the film as text being the primary mode of engagement. Think, for example, of the language we use to describe the work we do, which is likewise an artifact of this past. We speak of film language, the idea of film being a text, or of the intertextuality, subtext, and context of the film, and most egregiously, the notion of doing a reading of a film. 2. an ardent desire on the part of early film studies scholars to establish film as its own discipline. This is an inheritance also of early film theorists such as the aforementioned Canuto or Dulac, who pointed to the express difference between forms as the exact reason for distinction and individuation. In other words, by having film housed under the English department, we are not recognizing or even outright denying the formal differences between film and the written word, to the extent that individuation should not be or is not possible. This is affirmed by what Smoodin wrote 7 years later in his 2014 article As the Archive Turned, Writing Film Histories Without Films. Changes in the relationship of film studies to other disciplines have contributed to shifts in methodologies. Film studies itself, of course, has been an academic discipline for a very long time, even predating the famous Harvard lectures organized by Joseph P. Kennedy in 1927. At least since the 1950s and 1960s, however, as film studies gained even more traction at the university, it did so in part through an alignment with literary disciplines. In fact, film studies often was taught in English or in language departments, a practice that still exists today. This association with these older disciplines probably meant the migration of literary methodologies to film studies, leading to a concentration on film texts at the expense of others. An archival turn might indicate the maturation of film studies and its independence from other disciplines. So now, what we might call traditional textual analysis can coexist as a favored methodology with practices perhaps more aligned with the social sciences. The methodological shift, what Smoodin calls the archival turn, is a step in the individuation process of film studies at the institutional level, a process which unfolds along much the same lines drawn by Canuto, Dulac, and Chatman. To come into one's own, one needs to learn to stand on one's own. Thus, for film to be considered a whole, individual discipline, it must necessarily shed the institutional practices it inherited from the previously established English departments. What results, as Smoodin's 2014 article title suggests, is a new way of approaching film studies that decentered the film itself. No longer did film scholars have to bend to the film as text method and were free to look at other material, things like scrapbooks, industry and fan magazines, court cases, and so forth. The floodgates of opportunity opened wide for students and scholars to investigate beyond the film as a closed-off object and instead look upon the whole ecosystem, the cinema as a whole, laid bare for wonder and study. Okay, but why? As Smoodin points out, efforts to decenter the film as text were made from the very beginning. There is nothing inherent about film or film studies that requires it to be studied in the way that literature is studied. How that came about is a result of classes like Gessner's being successful and early enough in the game to catch on, beating out other just as possible methods. However, these decentering efforts were not the result of a random and radical change of heart, at least not entirely, but I'll get to that in a second, but due to years of growing cultural and social interests in film as a cultural item, as showcased in efforts to preserve relevant documents and material, both film and non-film in nature. As regard for film increased due to a plethora of factors not limited to institutional support from the Western intelligentsia discussed, but others that are beyond the scope of this project, so did preservation efforts. In film becoming something worth looking at and thinking about, it became something worth keeping. And with so many archive materials to look at, the scope for what film scholars could look at and could study expanded exponentially, hence the archival turn. Worth noting is that this shift in the practice of the discipline that Smoodin identifies, the one that decentered the film itself, is not necessarily synonymous with the archival turn as he defines it in his article. Rather, Smoodin's archival turn is a symptom of a greater philosophical change occurring within film criticism, scholarship, theory, and thinking, one much harder to pin down than the archival turn. Smoodin himself seems to struggle, writing that this shift began perhaps around 1980 or 1985 or 1990. Looking back at conversations held within film institutionally and wider, we see why these dates stand out. In 1980, psychoanalysts and philosophers Gilles, Deleuze, and Félix Guattari released 1,000 Plateaus, in which they conceptualize a state or plane of immanence, an inversion of transcendence, a state of pure immersion or interiority, a way of being and thinking mirrored, or to a certain extent, analogous to the cinematic. In 1992, in her chapter Phenomenology and Film Experience from the book The Address of the Eye, media critic and film theorist Vivian Sobchak criticized psychoanalytic film theorists like Jean-Louis Baudry, who believed that the cinematic apparatus was made in the image, so to speak, of the psychic apparatus, and stated that this formulation did not account for the reversibility of cinema on the psyche. Like Deleuze, she was noticing that our way of thinking, our psyche itself, was being changed by film just as much as our psyche had formed it. All of this said, there's an elephant in the room that we need to acknowledge. There's a problematic through line that can be felt lingering under all these arguments. Maybe you've picked up on it. It can be summed up in one word: domination. It seems, at least to me, like nearly all these writers, in one way or another, conscious or not, are hung up on the idea of domination and its negation, subordination. We see it all the way back in the early 20th century with Canuto and Dulanc's warm welcome to film hinging on the fact of its domination, its triumph over all odds, its imposition, which is the word that Canuto explicitly uses among the established forms. In Canuto's case, it's done what theater, for example, which is too ephemeral, according to him, could not. For Dulac, film achieved being, selfhood, in spite of the difficulty, the seeming impossibility of a new art form taking root. With Chatman, the problems of domination and subordination are clearer. When it comes to delivering a narrative, novels are better, aka dominant, and films are fine but inferior, aka subordinate. At the institutional level, we see literary analysis dominate as the methodological approach for about 100 years before, according to Smoot and others like Allen and Gomery, film studies finally finds, at the institutional level, its footing and ventures out on its own, emboldened by its vast network of archived material. Even with Deleuze and Sobchak, domination is subtle but conceptually present. As film becomes a dominant cultural, artistic form, it dominates us. We become subordinate to it. Our mental processes are changed by it. Is domination and subordination the only way? Is our conversation here one of which is better, stronger, a question of who wins in the end? Film, novels, film studies, English departments, so on? I don't think so. At least, I don't think this is an inherent reality, and I'm not alone. In 1977, Charles F. Altman published Toward a Historiography of American Film, in which he outlined a multitude of methodological approaches to film history that, as Smoot says, sought to decenter the film as central text. He outlined 13 different approaches, to be exact. His fourth approach, titled Film and the Other Arts, stand out as it welcomes the use of other non-film art forms in their scholastic and cultural value in the study of film. In justifying this method, he wrote, "This method is highly influenced by the fact that film history was born virtually with the invention of the cinema. Early critics had no significant predecessors to compare Porter or Méliès to, so they looked to the other contemporary arts for their comparanda. Little had changed in this practice today. The film most often compared to other arts is early film. The arts most often referred to are contemporary arts, yet some of the most obvious instances of direct influence occur later and involve arts long dead. Likewise, the early Western must be compared not only to the turn-of-the-century dime novel, but also the medieval epics from which the Westerns borrow its value system, character types, and plot patterns, a comparison already suggested by Bazin." There is an acknowledgement here that looking to other arts was, at least at the beginning of film history, a necessity, given the relative newness of film as a discipline. The sentiment might have been that with no one to look at within the cinema, we had to get crafty. Now, the need is not. We have enough within cinema to sustain ourselves. However, Altman warns against this isolationist tendency. He says, "We need to avoid the assumption that film only borrows from other arts without contributing to them." We can read this statement from Altman as a warning. In attempting to assert film as its own, in this desperate rush to individuate ourselves, we risk isolating ourselves entirely from the other arts, denying our influence, which would paradoxically be entirely contrary to the mission of establishing film as its own unique form. We acknowledge that literature's ability to shape film studies at the institutional level is a subordination on the part of film to some degree, but in radically bucking the trend, we also risk subordination by denying film's ability to influence other art forms, just as, if not more, than it has been influenced itself. Consider this passage from Middlesex, a novel published in 2002 by Jeffrey Eugenides. "I give you now the entire pregnancy in time-lapse. Desdemona, at 8 weeks, lies on her back, bed covers drawn up to her armpits. The light at the window flickers with the change of day and night. Her body jerks, she's on her side, her belly, the covers change shape. A wool blanket appears and disappears. Food trays fly to the bedside table, then jump away before returning. But throughout the mad dance of inanimate objects, the continuity of Desdemona's shifting body remains at center. Her breasts inflate. Her nipples darken. At 14 weeks, her face begins to grow plump, so that for the first time I can recognize the Yaya of my childhood. At 20 weeks, a mysterious line starts drawing itself down from her navel. Her belly rises like Jiffy Pop. At 30 weeks, her skin thins and her hair gets thicker. Her complexion, pale with nausea at first, grows less so until there it is, a glow. The bigger she gets, the more stationary. She stops lying on her stomach. Motionless, she swells towards the camera. The window strobe effect continues. At 36 weeks, she cocoons herself in bed sheets. The sheets go up and down, revealing her face, exhausted, euphoric, resigned, impatient. Her eyes open. She cries out. Now, consider the following. The novel has nothing to do with film. It is not a book about film or film theory in the slightest. Jeffrey Eugenides, besides reading over and approving/disapproving the script for Virgin Suicides, which came out in 1999, directed by Sofia Coppola, has little to no film or cinema experience for himself. The book also won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2003, was featured on Oprah's Book Club in 2007, and as of 2013, has sold more than 4 million copies worldwide. By all intents and purposes, Middlesex is a popular book. And in this paragraph, and in a few other passages in the book, Eugenides seamlessly transitions from the classic literary mode into what can only be described as a filmic mode, referring to a camera, to lighting, to time-lapse, to explicit cinematic techniques, in order to tell the narrative that he wishes to tell. It is not written as a script. It cannot be easily adapted to film. To do so would, according to Chatman, lose the original story some of its fidelity. However, paradoxically, it also complicates Chatman's assertions. How would this be told in any other way without using cinematic technique? Is the idea of a fast-forward, a time-lapse, conceptually possible prior to film? A time-lapse is not only a formal technique, but a narrative, thematic one as well. It communicates something to viewers, or in this case readers, different from other formal techniques, such as montage or time skip, indicated by a title card, for example. The literary equivalent might be a line break, the start of a new chapter, or a transitional phrase like later on in the pregnancy. Yet all of these communicate something very different. In order to communicate what he wants exactly as he wants, Eugenides turns to film, to cinematic technique. This is one of endless cases of film influencing literature explicitly among the other arts. Yet conversations are more readily had about the influence of film on these other arts that are not as readily done so with literature or novels, with the exclusion, as Altman points out, of adaptation, in part due to the tense institutional past between novels and films, or literary analysis and film studies. However, we must acknowledge that what Eugenides does in Middlesex is indicative of film studies becoming individuated in another way, one that isn't predicated on ideas of domination and subordination. Rather, film becomes individuated through transcendence into subjective rather than objective being. Film in its individuated form becomes as much a subject of history as an object of it. Accounting for this, film studies becomes a way we do historical research rather than being one of the disciplines which adopts existing historical methods. How would we do this? What I'm suggesting here is in no way new, and in fact builds off existing efforts, especially those made by media archaeologists. If the archival turn was a symptom of a philosophical change taking place beginning around the 1980s, another one is the new film history movement, as identified by media archaeology theorist Wanda Stravern in her chapter Media Archaeology, Where Film History, Media Art, and New Media Can Meet, published 2013. Inaugurated at the 1978 FIAF conference by the Brighton Project, an archival effort which is analogous to Smooden's archival turn, the new film history movement attempted to conceive of media history in a non-linear, non-chronological way, given that media forms don't often overlap or develop in clear ways, leading to dead ends, for example, or re-emerging in later, newer technologies. Media archaeologist approaches, such as identifying the old and the new, Bolter and Grusin's idea of remediation for one, or the new and the old, Zelensky's deep time of the media, shows us time and time again that conceiving of history as a series of events, reiterations following iterations, is a misrepresentation of reality as it actually unfolds. In doing away with this linear, chronological notion of time and history and adopting a media archaeologist approach, the problems of domination and subordination and the fear of regression derailing film studies from its path of individuation fall away. Stravin herself points to Deleuze's philosophy as a grounding philosophy for this approach, primarily through the delusion concept of immanence, so the idea that our perceptions and our thinking have become cinematic, that the cinema is part of us. Consider how these media archaeological approaches identified by Stravin in 2013 parallel almost perfectly the observations and warnings of Altman, who insisted on the possibility that the most obvious instances of direct influence might occur later and involve arts long dead. And so we must keep ourselves sharp and open. Cinema has an effect on conceptions of the world, which thus has an effect on other arts. How these other arts are being changed at the hands of cinema and cinematic thinking taking hold tells us something valuable about cinema that we wouldn't get from just looking at films. As cinema's scope expands, it is our duty to adapt. Attempts have certainly been made by new film history, related media archaeologists and artists and scholars working post-archival turn, among others not mentioned within this essay, but we must continue to push beyond and not subject ourselves to any trivial constraints out of a misplaced fear of regression. Stravin calls for a widespread adoption of the media archaeologist attitude, urging that we, quote, should always study the past with genuine wonder, unquote. In true media archaeologist fashion, I propose an expansion and a promise to study the present and the future with equal genuine wonder.